Welcome to this episode of the Biology of Trauma podcast. I am your host, Dr. Aimie. In this episode, we will explore emotional regulation and the states of the nervous system through the lens of addiction. One of the reasons I chose to become a board-certified addiction medicine physician was because I wanted to learn more about trauma and the interface with the nervous system, and specifically how the body adapts to survive and function despite holding inner pain. That is why it was important for me to bring you this episode with my friend and guest, Dr. Janet Winhall, author, teacher, and psychotherapist. She is author of Treating Trauma and Addiction with the Felt Sense Polyvagal Model. What does it mean that our behaviors, conscious or unconscious, serve as state propellers, actually giving us exactly what we need in the moment, whether energy or numbing and disconnecting? By answering this question in this episode, you will not only come to understand yourself better and why you reach for that second or third cup of coffee or binge watch TV shows, but it will give you new eyes to understand addictions and their recovery. It will be a window into your own inner world and the felt sense of safety or danger that you live with. In this episode, you will learn why current pathologizing models for treating trauma and addiction is failing us, the important distinction between neuroception and interoception, how behaviors and substances can be state regulation strategies, why it's important to include body-mind connection in addiction recovery, how to connect with our body and allow ourselves to feel without numbing or disassociating, how chronic conditions may be treated with the Felt Sense Polyvagal Model, and finally, practical strategies on how to apply the felt sense practice in everyday life. Whether you want to understand your own behaviors better or are a practitioner in the addiction medicine space, you will enjoy this journey into the felt sense. Let's get started. So Jan, the work that you do is amazing. And I know that you know this because you see the results that your clients have. But for the audience, explain what the felt sense is, because I'm not sure that they will have heard that, and how you have kind of bridged that with the polyvagal for this felt sense polyvagal model that you use.
Yeah. So, it evolved over time that I brought those two basic natural processes in the body of neuroception, so connecting in with the autonomic nervous system, and how safe we are in our environment, and interoception, which is part of a felt sense process. So that's connecting with what's happening in my body, how do I feel, and what am I sensing, and how am I in here today is basically interoception. What's going on for me in my thoughts and my feelings, in my physical sensations in the body. So I brought those two basic processes together in the Felt Sense Polyvagal Model. And that happened over years of working with people. I started 40 years ago now, working with young women who were incest survivors. And I was surrounded by this traditional psychiatric model where a lot of these women were being diagnosed with borderline personality disorder and really, honestly, being treated terribly in the system. Terribly. And, Judith Herman's book came out back then, Trauma and Recovery, and I gobbled it up. And it just spoke to exactly what I was seeing and experiencing in the system. So that's what got me going with finding out there's another way to be with this. And, back then, feminist therapists were working a lot with issues around safety, which of course is all about the autonomic nervous system and polyvagal theory. And Judith Herman saw that, right? Perhaps because she'd been medically trained, so she knew about the ANS. We didn't talk about the autonomic nervous system as trauma therapists, but we did talk about numbing and flooding. And that was the first felt sense polyvagal model, really, the first version that I created, because what I saw there was the ways in which women were shifting back and forth in these states, right? Between the sympathetic activation and then the numbing and shutting down. And of course, what Steve Porges gave us, this dorsal branch of the vagus that he named as the numbing dissociative state. And so I saw that back there. I knew that through listening to women and hearing them telling me these stories about ways that they were soothing themselves, but also harming themselves, right? And it was clear back then, more so around like drinking, large amounts of alcohol or doing a lot of drugs, that this was a way of kind of, soothing this sympathetic rush. But what wasn't so clear was more of the self-harm around like cutting, picking at the body, pulling the hair, those kinds of things, right? And those were being seen in this traditional psychiatric system as self-mutilation or masochism or attention seeking. And it didn't match what I was hearing from these young women. They weren't behaving like that with me. And as we listened more and more, it became clear, and I learned from the group too back then. We all learned together, really, that those behaviors that were less kind of clearly understandable were also, they knew that they hurt them, but they also felt like it helped them, but they couldn't explain it. So my curious brain and body went on a hunt to try to figure that out, really. And I first then found Jean Gendlin's work in focusing and the felt sense. And so here was a whole body of work and therapists working in focusing-oriented psychotherapy who were connecting in with what people were experiencing in their bodies. And so I knew I needed to go to that somatic place back then. So the felt sense, one of the simplest ways to describe it, it's like people call it the spidey sense. It's part of intuition. It's a bit like when you leave the house to go off to visit your friend, and there's this niggly feeling that something you didn't do, something is missing, not right, whatever. There's some place in there that knows, but it's implicit. And then all of a sudden, what comes is, I forgot to lock the door, or I forgot my keys, and then there's this, oh, yeah. And it feels better. That's a felt shift in the body that we talk about that helps us to really pay attention to what our body knows that maybe our head hasn't caught up with yet. And problems are like that too. We'll get this niggly feeling that doesn't feel good. You wake up and you think, ugh, am I getting sick? Well, I don't think so, but I don't feel good. My stomach's in a knot. And then you go and, we have coffee together and we talk and you say, what's going on, Jan? And I start to tell you. And then I just start to feel better because you've given me this space and listen to me without judging me. And bodies love that. And then they kind of start to light up. And what we know in our body begins to connect with what we know in our mind. And then we have this beautiful space of integration. And it feels good, right? Even if what I tell you is terrible, it still feels better because it's out there and I'm connected to it. And now I'm an integrated person. I know what's going on in me. So that's parts of how we work with a felt sense of what's going on. Yeah. And that's Gendlin's work originally.
And I'm thinking of the work that you're now doing really heavily with the whole addiction model, and being able to apply this to those behaviors that are very much falling in line with this kind of numbing and flooding, where self-harm, but yet for some reason that sometimes they can't seem to explain, it helps them feel better.
Yeah.
And it helps them feel better even on a survival level, that makes them do things that they promise that they will never, ever, ever do again, only to find themselves doing that very thing because it feels such like a strong survival impulse of their body.
Yes.
And how do you apply this felt sense then to those people who are stuck in that cycle? And Jan, do it in a safe way, because I can only imagine that it could be quite difficult, challenging for them to connect with their body and to feel things that they have not wanted to feel. And here's Jan telling them to feel their body, and they're like, I don't want to feel this body. So how do you apply it to the addiction behaviors, but then also how do you do that in a safe way that guides them through that process?
So the way we understand addiction through the polyvagal lens, through the nervous system, is that these are really what Steve calls state regulation strategies. I call them propellers, because these behaviors shift you. They propel you from one autonomic state to another, right? So when there isn't enough safety or perceived safety, because sometimes we get locked in these trauma feedback loops. But originally what occurs is when a person does not feel safe enough to be integrated into a full felt sense experience. I know what I'm thinking, feeling, physical sensations in my body, and also memories. That's a nice integrated sweet spot. But when we are in environments, either growing up where we don't feel safe, or it can also occur later on in life when terrible tragedy or whatever happens. It can occur right from the very beginning of life if we're marginalized and we don't feel and we aren't safe in the world, that the body then shifts into a sympathetic response, flight, fight, to try to survive. Well, we can't stay there forever because adrenaline and cortisol, as you know full well, are pumping like crazy. And so the body, I believe, instinctively seeks out behaviors that help us to make that shift down into the dorsal branch through, for example, drinking. It's a really great one. But there are others, like cutting the body releases endogenous opioids. And endogenous opioids shift you into a dorsal state. That's really interesting to consider. This is not masochism. This is the body saying, I can't cope with this level of intensity and a sympathetic response, and I'm designed to shut down to survive, to seek out that dorsal branch in order to adapt to a maladaptive environment, not a maladaptive person. And, it also works the other way with cutting. Cutting's a really interesting one. So if you're too long in a dorsal state, if you cut the body, it can also release sympathetic response of adrenaline, whatever. So people shift back up into sympathetic. So addictions we see as having a very powerful function, adaptive function in a body that is not perceived as safe enough to be to stay in the ventral branch. And so in addictions, we work very gently, harnessing the wisdom of the body and the autonomic nervous system, and teaching clients. There's a lot of psychoeducation in the felt sense polyvagal model. I'm working with the nervous system and teaching clients also a bit about how that works in the body and how we're going to really honor your body's need to be in this dorsal shutdown state a lot of the time. And that through co-regulation, we make a relationship. And over time, we work with the body to practice more and more presence around noticing what's going on in your body, connecting a little bit, just a little bit over time. And we also begin then slowly to introduce focusing practice, because there's six steps to a focusing practice with partners. So I work in groups and with partnerships with felt sense polyvagal accountability partnerships in slowly easing up on those behaviors. So it's a harm reduction model because we're working with the body and increasing that sense of safety over time. And of course, people have to also be in an environment where at least for a moment in time, they can go inside and learn to find some place in there that feels safe enough to become a little more present. So it's a gentle but firm, because addictions are, tricky, because we just need to survive, right? So we get that. We get that. And when you reframe it like that, it's just really wonderful work because you're not in a power struggle. You're working in collaboration with this person's body and their desire to adapt to an environment that hasn't created enough safety.
And when we understand that the body does have this intelligent design and that it is operating from the only standpoint that it knows, which is survival, and being able to see it from that lens, it's like, isn't this interesting? We get to be curious. Isn't that interesting that my body feels that this is the only solution right now for survival? And it allows us to gain perspective when we can notice and get to that level of curiosity and perspective of the body rather than the traditional model, which is very shaming still.
Yeah.
Right? How could you do this?
Yeah. Even in the best of circumstances, we still, the models for addiction, you're either morally bad or you're sick. But really, when you think about it, a lot of people actually do stop addictive behaviors completely. Cold turkey. A lot of people do that. If addiction is a disease, how do you just stop? How do you just decide one day you're going to stop? Because, it's a very common thing in addiction that we don't talk about very much because it doesn't match the current models, right? Of course, diseases come from addiction, but the function of addiction through a somatic polyvagal felt sense lens is to survive. And, when I think back to these incredible young women that I worked with, I mean, how else? Thank goodness that bodies can dissociate from rape and the level of betrayal of incest. Really. How else would we survive?
Right.
This is a gift in that environment.
Mm-hmm.
The problem, of course, is that we move out of those environments if we're lucky enough. And if we're able to get into an environment that is safe enough, the body is still often locked in the trauma feedback loop. But that's where we come in, right? As therapists to explain that to people and that there are specific things you can do to rewire. And one of those things is a focusing felt sense practice. And there are lots of others. Engaging socially, connecting with your friends. Meditation. My son will do it through playing the piano. Come into the house, and I don't even talk to him then. He just goes right to the piano. And then 20 minutes later, he's shifted into ventral. And then we'll joke about it, geez, I was so mad. And there it is. That's a ventral practice, right?
Yeah. And I love how we can see these just as state regulators, or as you say, state propellers.
Yeah.
And I like that terminology, Jan, because that's very much how it can feel, right? Like this is propelling you. Like this is not necessarily a gentle,
Yeah.
Yeah. Like, whoa, we're going to propel you right into that dorsal vagal response, or from that dorsal up into sympathetic with all the adrenaline just released. It very much feels like the fast road.
Yeah.
And when we can see that, an addiction is just one of those state propellers. And food can be another one. The piano can be another one. Meditation can be one. We can see that then there are these buffet options that are presented to us of, well, let me try another tool for state regulation. You're talking about the addiction can fall away overnight for some people. And it's not that they all of a sudden didn't need a state regulator. It's that they switched state regulators and they were able to access something else as their state regulator.
Yes, with the difference being, we would say in focusing that a felt shift in the body would be a shift in those ventral states, that bring you into grounding. Whereas an addictive shift doesn't carry you forward. It doesn't have meaning. It doesn't hold a felt sense. It's really just that pure kind of physiological shifting that happens, right? It doesn't have integration.
And what's fascinating to me is that it seems like the felt sense is the polar opposite of an addiction.
That's right.
Like the addiction for many of the substances, not necessarily all of them, but for many of them, the point is to not feel.
Yes.
And then,
or to feel sensation, but not emotion, or not a full experience that's connected to your whole self, right? It could be an excitement, an adrenaline rush.
Right.
But that's really different than how does all of me feel about what's happening in this moment?
That's a really good point, because many patients of mine would describe, I don't feel much of anything.
Yeah.
And so here is then that desire to feel something, but yet not the emotional stuff.
Yeah. Not the fearing into your life and all the little threads that go with that, because that might take you down a road that feels painful. So you back up because, being present, it's all about being present, right? Being present has been painful. So we go to these addictive states to protect ourselves, to adapt to that. But in a full felt sense, presence is remarkable.
And yet, Jan, when you start to talk about presence and how being present in our life can be painful, you're no longer just talking to those who have an addiction.
No.
You're now talking to a lot of people. And so this felt sense really is a powerful tool for anyone with a human body and an autonomic nervous system.
Absolutely. And, Gendlin knew this, right? In this beautiful little book he wrote called Focusing way back in 1978. I mean, he's dead now. He started this work with Carl Rogers, actually, in the 50s in the University of Chicago. And what they found when they were studying, what is it that produces change? How do people heal? And what they saw in thousands of process recordings that they did of psychotherapy sessions that were successful was that you could see the change happen in the body. You could see people shifting states. And he called that the felt shift, which it is. That's the interoceptive part of it, like the feeling into the intuitive part of it. But we also see those changes in the autonomic nervous system, right? Like if I'm in a dorsal state, I'm down here. And you can feel that in your body. And if I look up at you and I smile and we know each other a bit and it's fun, I'm socially engaged and I'm in ventral, and you can see the difference in my body. And so that's what I bridged. That's what I crossed together was the felt shift. Oh yeah, now I get it, right? That feeling. Now I know why that was bugging me. That shift. And then the shift that is also there in the autonomic nervous system that comes into ventral and brings us into such a sweet spot, right? Of really being present. So, we can use these processes for anything. I worked with them in a lot of addiction because that's where it started, was with self-harm. But of course, with chronic pain, with all of the things that you work with, Aimie, especially chronic pain, because we can bring attention to parts of the body that still can feel okay. And then work with that kind of attention, as a skill building practice, right? It's wonderful work.
It's wonderful work, and the transformations that happen are lasting,
Yes.
right? Because you have these experiences with your body, with your nervous system, and you learn things that you're never going to forget. Like
And the body doesn't forget those things. When you get that shift into presence, sometimes I will be working with someone who's really locked into the addictive place. And just through co-regulating and seeing me, will be like, hello in there, and bodies don't forget that. And so, it comes again, and then you're building a new neural pathway into that sweet spot with a whole felt sense of wonder and joy of connecting with another person. And that's really what the co-regulating process is about, right?
So to finish up, walk us through what are those 6 steps to the felt sense practice that you mentioned?
So the first step that Gendlin added actually after working with this whole idea of the felt sense is clearing a space. And that really is like a meditation practice where it's a little bit different in that you first ask, what's coming between me and feeling okay? And you take that down inside. And, usually there's 4 or 5 things that are roaming around in there. Sometimes there's more, sometimes there's a bit less. And he taught us how to take each of those and gather them up and put them just at the right distance from you in here. So it's like a meditation process. And then after you've done that, you kind of invite your body to choose one of them to spend time with. Because focusing really originally came from working with problems in your life as a way of doing that, right? Connecting with what's going on in there that's creating discomfort. So then one of those things comes back in, and you learn how to, as people are saying so much now, sit with it, to be with it and to be curious about it, but not to fall into it, right? So it's a lot of titrating, getting the right closeness and distance from whatever that is that's, say, in your tummy that you woke up with that doesn't feel good. And when we do that, especially in partnerships, and our friend says, or our partner says, what's going on in there? What does it need? Or what's the worst of it? Or is it okay to stay with it? Or then it starts to open, right? And then we get a handle for that place in there. That's like a word or a phrase that really captures the essence of what it is. And each time that happens, it starts to become clear about what is really going on in there, right? And then we might resonate with that, say it back. Is that the right handle? Is it kind of the handles sound funny because they come from the right hemisphere, right? The body, they might be a squiggly, stuck place or a blue, vague, cloudy place, or might be an image, or it might be a gesture in the body, a movement in the body. And then we might spend some time asking into it, more about it, but not up here. We follow what's going on physically down, often in the center, around in the center of the body. And then the last step is to really welcome and appreciate what came, even and especially when it's uncomfortable. Because the more we know about all of how we're living our lives, the more we can really integrate it and not run from what's uncomfortable, which is what we're taught to do in this Western culture. And it's killing us. It's like the things that build up under the rug and then you flip over it. It's killing us. We have to get this right. Yeah. Because when we're not connected to our bodies, we really hurt ourselves, each other, and the natural world, which is where we are right now.
And I'm thinking of those people who have some type of chronic illness. You mentioned chronic pain earlier.
Yeah.
And yet for so many other chronic illnesses, being in their body, feeling their body is the last thing that they want to do. Their body hurts. And so for them? Like what would be
Well,
that?
we work then with one place in the body. If you can find at the tip of your nose, your earlobes, your toes. It's also really helpful for working with ADHD because you're working with attention. That's what you're working with, right? And healing, so much of healing is what you pay attention to. So we might go there. If that doesn't feel good, we might look for an experience. So getting the whole felt sense of the experience of this moment that feels good to me right now. So you might ask a client, is there a moment in time that feels good for you? Just a little moment. It doesn't have to be anything fancy, It could be saying hi to your neighbor in the morning. And where do you feel that in your body? Oh, it's actually right here. And then we help people to put a hand where you feel it because it really helps to kind of ground it. And then we use body cards as a way of people can write or draw or color where they feel it in the body. And then you can resource them. And it's incredibly powerful to resource that visually because you might think I can't find anything of that. No, there's no way. And then you look at this image of this warm glow that you have in your chest. And you think, well, I don't know where the heck that is, but I did feel that. And I've got a witness. Jan saw me, that was there. That was real. And it's interesting how slowly over time, especially if we do it together, it can start to form again, right? You can't push it, but you can invite it. And bodies want us to heal. They want to carry forward. So very often there is some place in there that we can begin to form or go back to. Yeah. And if there isn't in that moment, well, we just welcome being together. Here we are in this hard place together. Yeah. Yeah. Trusting that it'll come. Because bodies know how to heal if you give them what they need. This is what Jen taught us. If you give a body what it needs, it knows how to keep going and moving towards the sunlight, just like plants do, Yeah.
Thank you for joining me for this episode of the Biology of Trauma podcast. If you would like to know more about the interface of behaviors, stored trauma in the body, and addictions, then I have resources for you. In the show notes, you will find links to a guide for the chronic freeze response. This free guide will help you recognize what a functional freeze state is and how to bring in safety and create that safety for you to change your state. There are also some supplements that I want to bring to your attention because whether it's addiction or chronic stress and trauma, magnesium is one of the most common nutrient deficiencies that people have. And I will have a link to the magnesium that I take. I also want to bring attention to the fact that a chronic trauma state leaves us without the energy to even come out and do the healing work. And so mitochondrial support becomes an essential piece to giving our body the energy at a cellular level that it needs to come out of a chronic trauma or freeze response. I'll have the link to the mitochondrial support that I use. If you're actually ready to do something about changing your neuroception, your nervous system state, well, then you will want to look at the Foundational Journey. This is a 6-week online course where you are safely guided into your inner world to teach you how to create your inner safety. You can join me and my team of mentors. These are live classes over 6 weeks that will teach you practical somatic and parts self-practices for you to lay your foundation of regulation and experience breakthroughs. There are related podcast episodes to this one, including episode number 34, which was with Dr. Steve Porges, on what does the polyvagal lens say about attachment, freeze, and functional disease. Episode 67 was with Dr. Gabor Mate on healing trauma and chronic illness through connection. You can head over to the YouTube channel where there is a video on addiction recovery, resilience, and relapse with applying energy psychology with Dr. David Feinstein. And how does regulation affect my physical health? I am here to save you time and money by bringing you practical information that will help you accelerate the trauma healing journey. So please take a moment to subscribe, rate, or leave a review. Your reviews and feedback are how I know how to improve this podcast, bring you great content, and help others find information that will change their life. I'm your host, Dr. Aimie. Until next episode, lots of love.